Hey, I hope everyone's staying safe and doing well during this pandemic. On today's episode of PsychE-Learning, I'll be talking about psychopaths. This term has been widely misused by a lot of people and is oftentimes misunderstood. So that is why I wanted to go deeper into it. So the question is, what is a psychopath? Well, the general definition of psychopathy is that it is a condition characterized by the lack of empathy, being insensitive, and disregarding others, which would enable them to be highly manipulative. Also, psychopathy is one of the hardest personality disorders to spot. Psychopaths can blend in very well with crowds and they can appear charming and charismatic, but underneath all that act lies a lack of a conscience and a moral compass. Their antisocial nature can lead them to criminality, but of course, this does not apply to all the individuals with this condition. Psychopathy is clinically known as antisocial personality disorder according to the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Disorders. Some troublesome psychopathic traits include an egocentric identity, an absence of prosocial standards in goal setting, lack of empathy, incapacity for mutually intimate relationships, manipulativeness, deceitfulness, callousness, irresponsibility, impulsivity, and risk taking, and hostility. Antisocial behavior and psychopathy can be diagnosed using the Psychopathy Checklist Revised, the PCL-R, and the PPI, which stands for Psychopathic Personality Inventory. The Half Psychopathy Checklist was developed in 1970 by Canadian researcher Robert Half. This checklist features traits such as lack of empathy, pathological lying, and impulsivity. And this checklist is scored with a range that goes from 0 does not apply, 1 applies to a certain extent, and 2 applies fully. The bar for clinical psychopathy is a score of 30, and an interesting fact is that serial killer Ted Bundy scored 39, which is pretty high. But since 1970 was a while ago and the world keeps developing and advancing, a revised version of this checklist has been presented. So the revised version of the PCL-R includes the following characteristics listed here: superficial charm, grandiose self-worth, need for stimulation, proneness to boredom, pathological lying, cunning and manipulative, lack of remorse or guilt, shallow affect, callous and lack of empathy, parasitic lifestyle, poor behavioral controls, promiscuous sexual behavior, early behavioral problems, lack of realistic long-term goals, impulsivity, irresponsibility, failure to accept responsibility for one's own actions, many short-term marital relationships, juvenile delinquency, revocation of conditional release, and criminal versatility. So just to go briefly over the PPI, the Psychopathic Personality Inventory, it was developed by Scott Lilienfeld and Brian Andrews, and they basically wanted to test for psychopathic traits in non-criminal populations. So the main difference between this test and the previous checklist that I presented is that the PPI is a self-report scale, while the HAR checklist is an interview-based assessment, and its primary goal is to look for psychopathic traits without assuming particular links to antisocial or criminal behavior. So now just to look at the subscales of this inventory, it includes Machiavellian egocentricity, which is a lack of empathy and a sense of detachment from others for the sake of achieving one's own goals; social potency, the ability to charm and influence others; cold-heartedness, which is a distinct lack of emotion or guilt in regards to other people's feelings; a carefree non-planfulness, which is the difficulty in planning ahead and considering the consequences that lie ahead; fearlessness, and eagerness for risk-seeking behaviors, as well as a lack of the fear that normally goes with them. Blame externalization is the inability to take responsibility for one's own actions and usually blaming others for it. Impulsiveness Nonconformity is a disregard for social norms and culturally acceptable behaviors. And finally, stress immunity is a lack of typical marked reactions to traumatic or otherwise stress inducing events. Additionally, the PPI includes two validity scales, which just means that random questions are inserted so that the investigators can make sure that the participants respond honestly and truthfully. So, psychopathic tendencies can be the warning signs for psychopathy, but it is important to note that not everyone who shows psychopathic tendencies are going to become a psychopath or that they are a psychopath. Psychopathic traits are oftentimes influenced by genetics, and that is why sometimes you can find a child that's 9 years old, for example, and has psychopathic traits. But research also shows that they can be caused by non genetic factors such as the environment. In a 2017 study led by the University of Wisconsin-Madison, it was discovered that psychopaths have reduced connections in the areas of the brains that are involved with fear, anxiety, empathy, and sentimentality. So, just to get a better understanding of what the study is trying to explain, I'm gonna go deeper into how the brain is involved in our moral and social behavior. The limbic system, which is shown right here, deals with the emotions. More specifically, a small organ, the amygdala, interprets emotions of others. So, what this means is that someone is able to understand and process when someone is afraid, for example. However, for psychopaths, this organ does not function properly. So, in the case that someone is scared, a psychopath would maybe recognize that, but would not be concerned and it wouldn't affect him. The next important part of the brain is the orbital frontal cortex, which deals with our moral attitude, making the difference between what is right and what is wrong. This function of the brain is also absent in psychopaths, allowing them to do as they please or as they see fit with no limits. Now I'll be presenting two dilemmas, and I just want you to think about what you would do in both scenarios. Now I'll be presenting two pictures of brain scans, and I just want you to think of which one would correspond to your brain after what we discussed about the brain structure and how moral and social behavior are involved with the different areas of the brain. If you chose the picture on the left, then you are correct, and is how your brain is supposed to look because those areas of the brain are lit up. Those areas in a psychopath's brain would not light up because those do not function for that individual. Now, I want to emphasize this. Not all psychopaths are killers or criminals, and not all criminals are psychopaths. So, you might even be surprised to know that psychopaths have positive characteristics such as they are assertive, they don't procrastinate, they don't beat themselves up for doing something wrong, even though they are to blame, and they deal very well under pressure. And all these characteristics can be very advantageous for people because it can take them very far and there is no stopping them. So, this all leads up to the question, can psychopathy be cured? Psychopathy is a personality disorder, it is not a mental illness, therefore, it cannot be cured. But Dr. Inigo Blackwood, who is a leading forensic psychiatrist at King's College London, has stated that adult psychopaths can be treated and maintained but not cured. So there is no cure for psychopaths since they don't really care to change because they think everything is fine with them and they don't recognize that anything is wrong with them. However, understanding how psychopathy can develop from a child to an adult is very important. And it is important because a child that is at risk and shows some psychopathic behaviors can be prevented from becoming a dangerous psychopath. So you might ask, how can this be prevented? Well, the answer is pretty straightforward. It really depends on the environment and the people that he is surrounded with. And a great example for this is the story of a neuroscientist, Dr. James Fallon, who made an astonishing discovery that on paper he is categorized as a psychopath. It was found that he had low activities in certain areas of the frontal and temporal lobe, and that he faced challenges with empathy, morality, and self-control. Even looking at his family history, there is a genetic factor that also played a role. Even with all of that, Dr. James Fallon was far from being an aggressive and violent psychopath. So, why not? Well, his answer to that was that he received a lot of love from his mother and was brought up in a very healthy environment, and that led him to becoming a pro-social psychopath. It is great because he is showing that not all psychopaths are violent and that they can lead a pretty successful and happy life. He has kids, he has a wife, and he has a very successful career as a neuroscientist. With that, you got to go through a little tour of what goes on in a psychopath's mind. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching, and thank you to everyone who's been showing us support. We really appreciate it, and it means a lot.